body of work centers around a place that is special to Kate'Lyn's family and where her maternal and paternal family histories intertwine. That place is an agricultural area in KwaZulu-Natal entitled Sowati. Kate'Lyn's family first came to Sowati after indenture ended in 1911, when they were awarded land there. And in 1933, her great-grandparents built a temple and Hindu school on the land as part of a program that the government of the Union had initiated then. Her paternal family in turn rented land there between 1930 and the 1950s. Kate'Lyn's exhibition, entitled A Place Away, is based on the family's photographic archives, as well as other documentation that she has found in her research over the last 2 years. The artworks you see here today are her answer to many of the questions that the family archive could not answer. What did her maternal great-great-grandfather Niru Muke look like? What could she piece together of her paternal grandmother Ruby's life after her death, and her grandfather Ram Chetty's third marriage eclipsed her from the family photographs? Another question that we might now have, however, is what is a place away? During her conversations with family members and in excavating the photographic archives in the various places they were kept, Kate'Lyn came to realize that the landscape of Sowati was deeply intertwined with her family's sense of belonging in South Africa, and that it was even implicated in her own South African Indian identity. As she says in her dissertation, the waters of Sowati flow through her body. On this very symbolic day, which marks the 160th anniversary of the arrival of indentured Indian labourers in South Africa in 1860, we can look back on a very personal meditation on landscape, family, and belonging in Kate'Lyn's work. What is presented here is, in a sense, Kate'Lyn's own answer to the archive, her looking back, as it were, into the past and filling in gaps and making links where perhaps the family had not made any. The place away is part of this construction. What Katie has noticed in looking back over the visual family history is that Sowati, in the eyes of the family and its photographers, themselves family members, came to be portrayed as an idyllic place of sorts, even picturesque, a place that provided some shelter from the political upheavals that played out over the years in colonial and apartheid South Africa. The place away might not really exist. Marianne Hirsch, a scholar who is known for her work on trauma and what she refers to as post-memory, speaks about how family photographs often depict idealized versions of the past, omitting traumatic moments. This seems quite natural. When we take photographs, we tend to focus on the celebrations and the happy moments we want to capture for our family photo albums. In terms of this particular family's history, which is one history for Kate'Lyn rather than the history of two families, as she unites them, there is a stark contrast between the happy family life in Sowati and what was happening in the country. Most of the artworks on display here are based on photographs taken in the 1980s and 1990s, a tumultuous time in South African history, and all the more so in relation to land. The time is marked by several states of emergency and the beginnings of very large political changes towards democracy. Members of the Chetty family were, for example, subject to forced removals in Cato Manor. In the family archives depicting Sowati, however, there's no sign of this. Children pose in front of the river, smiling brightly in the sunshine. Adults gather for picnics, and groups of people represent the sense of family and belonging that suffuse these images. In the background is Sowati's landscapes, lush, fertile, and peaceful. The river is often there, running through history and providing for the families that lived around it. The artworks that are based on the archive are completely different, however. They present a much more complex view of place than the family photographs do. Here, Katie has manipulated images of the river. By transferring photographs to aluminium plates and biting them in acid, she had first intended to make aquatints based on the photographs. What emerged was so interesting in itself that it gave birth to a new visual language, where printmaking, photography, and digital post-production processes were combined. Instead of printing these images, Katie scanned the plates into digital files and manipulated them to arrive at layered and complicated images that start to tell a story of their own. Here, the Sowati River, as she refers to it due to another gap in the family's history, appears now in flood and now snaking between the hills of KwaZulu-Natal. This digital print, simply entitled Sowati River 90s, recalls photography in complex ways. When we look at it, we can tell that it used to be a photograph, but now it is something more. There is additional noise, the texture on the aluminium plate that comes through, and the incongruous green grass that tells us that this is also at the same time a digital image. This image now presents a view of Sowati that is suffused with the past, but which is also of the present moment. It is a visual time machine, transporting us to the special place that Katie has chosen to call the place away. In a sense, this idyllic landscape, with a formulaic river twisting pleasingly towards the horizon, is also a utopia, a no place. It does not exist other than in this artwork, and in Katie's imagined memory of the place, as it was in the past before she was born. Like an old printed photograph, there are blotches and signs of damage in this image, and we cannot really tell exactly where the river ends and the sky begins. The topography of the landscape is murky. Some information has been lost. This artwork depicting the river in flood is even more murky. Here it's not just the landscape that becomes unclear. It looks as though we're looking through a veil at the river. In a sense, this is a visual metaphor for the veil of memory, which obscures so much of the past in a family's passed down history. Who knows which details go missing when such histories get passed down between generations? The landscape of our past becomes imaginary landscapes, the landscapes of our past, taking on topographies that we sketch for them from photographs and memories. One may even consider the murk of history around Indian culture and identity in South Africa. Neglected for a long time during the apartheid regime, young artists such as Kate'Lyn revisit this history in the context of academic research that is sorely needed, and in artworks that tell the stories that were repressed in the past. In the process of unearthing this history, not everything is apparent, however, and instead the result is often more veiled and unclear than the researcher might like. In this print of Katie's grandfather Amichan and family at Sowati River in the 1970s, one can see more such signs of erasure and obscuring. There is a sense of familiarity in this image. We have all posed for such family photographs, and yet the noise of the aluminium plate and the digital processing here overpowers the figures to the point of obscuring them altogether. These portraits may leave one with more questions than answers. Who were the people in this image? What did they look like? Can we make out smiles? This image, like others where Katie uses this visual technique, may even fill us as viewers with a sense of foreboding. Where is the idyllic Sowati now? The way in which noise interferes with the photographs in these artworks points to what is obscured in such images. While family photographs paint a picture of a pleasant past, these images point to all not being quite as idyllic as family archives may make them seem. These images remind us that the language of photography is a language that often obscures as much as it reveals. While we may trust photographs to document our family histories, a more pertinent question is what they reveal about the absences or omissions in such histories. In many of these artworks, ghost images arise. Seemingly spontaneously, outlines of figures appear, and one may even imagine details where there are none. The almost brutal treatment that the artist has subjected these photographs to may furthermore be the unconscious surfacing of the undercurrent in South Africa when these images were taken. They also reveal something of the uncanny nature of photography. Portraits such as these are ominous because they have captured real people in a real place and as much as it is difficult to make out individual features, one knows when looking at such an image that this is a real moment in time. What becomes ominous or even disturbing is how little one can tell about these individual people. It points not only to the transience of time, but also the transience of memory in family life and also in social histories. That is why Kate'Lyn's work is all the more important, as it recovers in idiosyncratic ways histories that are often too obscure in social history. The history of Indian life in South Africa is not often foregrounded enough, and a lot of research is needed to recover this lack in how South African identity is regarded. In preparing to close, I want to consider one more aspect that is prominent in this body of work, and that is the temple building in Sowati. It is represented in many of the artworks in this exhibition. In artworks such as this one, entitled Temple and River, it has become almost a part of the topography. It blends into the landscape, tempting one to think that it had always been there. This is also symbolic in terms of its meaning to the family, representing a way for people to establish roots on the land and to practice their daily lives in relation to the land through this beautiful structure. This artwork, entitled Sowati Temple and School on its opening day in 1937, which is printed on paper that Kate'Lyn made from sugarcane, shows the first image the family has of the school and temple. Here I can perhaps then briefly summarize the various ways in which she has worked with the photographic family archive in this exhibition. This particular artwork is printed onto handmade paper. In order to make this paper, also used in several other artworks, the artist has to break down the sugarcane until it is digestible enough to process in an industrial beater, where it is further broken down to make a paper pulp. This pulp is then dyed by hand with the pigment fixed into the fibers, almost like one would develop a photograph chemically. The blue pulp is then cast onto a flat surface using a paper-making screen and pressed between many layers of wooden panels. It is dried over a period of time, and only then does a sheet of paper emerge. The sugarcane is, of course, very significant to this body of work, as it recalls the sugarcane plantations where many indentured labourers worked when they arrived from India. Kate'Lyn's labour in making the paper is a kind of echo of her forebears' labour and toil in the landscape of KwaZulu-Natal. The most prevalent technique used to make artworks in this exhibition relates to both printmaking and to photography. The majority of the larger and smaller prints you see on display here were made in a process that was both explorative and has given the artworks a unique appearance. These prints started out as aluminium plates that were destined for printmaking, but as I already mentioned, when Katie instead scanned them into digital files and started manipulating them, the result became more interesting than the prints they gave rise to. These images are layered, and at times we see, as I have pointed out, veils or screens, or even things that don't make visual sense. Another technique that Kate'Lyn explored here is cyanotype. This is a printmaking process that allows her to develop photographic images in the characteristic cyan tone, which is blue. The large image of the altar in the temple, still being used by her family today, even though they no longer live in Sowati, is impressive in scale, and producing such a large print is no mean feat. Once again, the labor of making this artwork may be thought of as the artist's own laborious engagement with her family archive. Through this labor, she transforms the scale of the temple to enormous proportions, impressing on the viewer how important the temple is to the family, but also how it interiorizes the landscape and its significance for the family. The temple, built by her family as a labor of belonging, echoes through time to the artist's own labor in drawing together these archival records and in engaging with these very personal artifacts on a physical level. The blue color, evident in much of this exhibition, is layered with meaning and suggestion. It recalls the association between the color indigo and India, as the Latin word indigo literally means color from India. Last, one may then refer to the aluminium plates themselves, which are usually obscured from view in printmaking. These are like negatives, not intended for the viewer, but here they further develop the links between histories and images and exist as echoes in the memory. As viewers, we're invited to look at what would usually remain hidden in the printmaking process, as we've been invited into the family archives by the artist, seeing behind the scenes and beneath the veil of the idyllic life the family lived in Sowati. I wish to extend my most warm congratulations to Kate'Lyn for completing this beautiful body of work during the most challenging time in recent history and against some daunting odds, to be able to commemorate the arrival of Indian people in South Africa on this day 160 years ago.